right, well, joining us on the line today is Douglas Rushkoff. He is an American media theorist, a writer, a columnist, and he's also a professor of media theory and digital economics at the City University of New York, Queens College. He has written a new book entitled Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. Douglas, it's great to have you on Follow the Money Radio.
Great to be with you.
Really is great. I've spent some time going over some of your material over the last several months. I've been following your work now for some time, and I'm very impressed with the way that you approach things. And I think what we would call it is basically a critic. I mean, you are a critic of the current system, and we need more critics today, because what has happened today in many ways is that people have become so disconnected, and yet we say that we are connected. I heard a recent TED Talk where you described an epiphany that you had regarding our modern read-only world versus our read-write capabilities. Explain this to our audience. Why do you believe it's so profound, and what does it mean to live in a read-write universe?
Well, I was a television baby. I guess that makes me old now. But,
Right.
I was raised in a world where you sat and watched TV, you read books, you read comic books, you went to movies. And understanding media meant really understanding how to interpret that, how to receive it, how to read it. And when I was in college, it was actually sort of the end of high school, beginning of college, I had my first exposure to computers. And this is back before PCs, when you had your own computer. It was more like you'd sit at a terminal, and the terminal would be connected to some big computer somewhere where everybody was sharing the resources of this one big mainframe. And when you were done sort of playing around or making something, and you had a little file or a little program you were working on, the computer would ask you at the end, do you want to save this as a read-only file or a read-write file? And I had no idea what that meant. So I, raised my hand, and the helper guy comes over and he says, oh, well, a read-only file is one that, other people can look at and they can't change. And if you save it as a read-write file, it means they can look at it, but they can also change it. I was like, wow, That's an interesting choice. And I went out into the world after that, and I started to think about all these different things, that my whole world that I had been living in to that point was a read-only universe. I had books, I had TV shows, I had radio shows, and I started to look at everything around. I lived in New York City at the time, and I went out to the grid pattern of the city, and I said, oh my gosh, this grid pattern, this is a read-only. They decided to make the city be a little bit, grids, and this isn't the only way they could have done a city. And I thought about the money in my pocket, and I said, well, look, money is read-only. You're not allowed to write money. The minute you write money, they throw you in jail. Or even looking in some cases, this got me interested in religion, looking at holy text, sacred text. They're read-only, because then they get locked down. They get, redacted, which means, it's like when they, last call, we're redacting this text, and then it's going to be, this sacred text is going to be just like this forever, which it turns out, of course, at least in Judaism, I found out that Midrash, which is a Torah commentary, is an open book. It's more like open source technology. It's this thing where you can keep adding comments, and you always, you put a footnote to the last rabbi, but then you add your own comment. You can keep doing new interpretations. So I became interested in, what are the living documents in our world, whether it's the, Torah or the Constitution or the human story? What aspects of it can we keep writing? Can we participate in? And which parts of it have been locked down unnecessarily? What things look to us like just the given circumstances of nature, the pre-existing conditions? How many of these landscapes that seem all totally set in stone are actually up for discussion? And of course, the biggest one of all that I've been wrestling with lately is money and business, and this idea that the only way for the economy to go is for it to grow. And my growing realization that a growth-based economy doesn't necessarily yield the greatest prosperity for all of the people in it.
Okay, that is a huge point you're making, Douglas. I mean, let's unpack that for a minute, because what you've just said, growth has become the catch-all solution to every modern problem today. I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. It's almost as if policymakers simply say growth, we just got to get more growth and it'll fix everything. But when you look from 0 AD all the way out till about 1850, middle of the 19th century, you see virtually no growth during that time. And any growth that you do see is mainly from population. Population growth was causing economic growth. But since the 80s, growth has been driven sky high through the creation of, through financialization and through, credit and debt. So as you point out, we are living now in an era where our house value is supposed to go up. Our stock market, our 401k is supposed to go up. Our wages are supposed to go up. Everything is supposed to go up. And yet that's unsustainable, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, and you don't even have to be a climate change advocate to realize that, we're on a fixed planet. There's only so much surface area. There's only so much human attention. You can put always on devices and strap them to yourself so that they ring and vibrate and buzz every time somebody's going to update you or tweet you or Facebook you or something else. And, we live this life that used to be endured only by 911 operators or air traffic controllers. But, at a certain point, we run out of room. This was the thing. They really realized it back around Eisenhower's time, right after World War II, when all of the places that we used to go to grow, all the colonies and, in South America and the West Indies and Africa, those places started to push back. And we moved into what people started to call post-colonialism. But the big problem was, wait a minute, if we've got no more colonies, if there's no more new territories to grow, what are we going to do? How's the economy going to continue? Because our economies, mathematically, its premise is that things are going to keep growing. We have an interest-bearing currency. You've got to pay back more than you borrowed. If you're going to pay back more than you borrowed, it means something had to grow. So technologists went to Eisenhower and said, don't worry, Dwight. There's a new landscape for growth. And this landscape is going to be created by all of these new technologies, by computers, that they would make a kind of a virtual surface area, new nooks and crannies, new folds. There'll be new territory, just like the infinite territory in a video game could serve as a whole new state or a new country or a new place to take over. But there's only so many people. There's only so much attention. And growth, it turns out growth for growth's sake ends up sapping the economy of its money rather than creating economic development. When you have a company that its only purpose is to grow in order to just convert some cash into share price, then they end up going to communities the way a Walmart might. You go into a town like a vacuum cleaner and you just suck all the money out of this place any way you can. You put all the local small businesses, put them all out of business, undercut their prices, do whatever you have to. Take all the people who were making money at regular jobs, make them part-time employees. You can externalize their medical costs to welfare by not paying them enough. You can, in that way, over maybe 20 or 30 years, suck all the money there is out of a place until there's no more money left. It takes 20 or 30 years if you do it in the traditional sense. But if you do it as a digital company, if you do it the way Amazon does or Uber does, then you suck the money out real fast. And you exacerbate a problem that, as my research shows, this is a problem that's been going on for 75 years in corporate America, in that corporate profit over corporate size has been going down for 75 years. That means corporations are really good at taking all the money off the table, but they're getting increasingly bad at deploying the money that they've taken. So they're like these giant, incapacitated, obese organisms that have stored all this money in fat, but don't really have any muscle. And they look at any new market just as a place to try to take the money out. But when they take the money out, what happens to their customers? What happens to their suppliers? What happens to the communities on which they were depending for income, for revenue? They're gone. They're bankrupt. And then they have to move to another one, or as you would put it, an increasingly abstracted financial instrument that's a derivative of a derivative of a derivative, in order to try to squeeze some growth out of this, the way, a muscle builder will shoot more steroids into himself to try to get, 1 more millimeter of muscle on this body that's about to explode.
You're listening to the voice of Douglas Rushkoff. He is an American media theorist, a writer, a columnist, a lecturer, and he is the professor of media theory and digital economics at the City University of New York, Queens College. Douglas, okay, so what you're saying is very, very provocative, I would think, to some people where these are virgin ears, where you're talking about corporations, and it is true that growth, which has been the mantra for so long, is simply become a bankrupt idea. Now, we even see how corporations have transformed, as you pointed out, also the purpose of technology. I mean, you point out modern technology is mainly used for consumptive purposes now, whereas it used to be more of a collaborative effort. It's the same thing, and we can even think about that in the form of the church. If you think about the Christian church in first century, it was designed to be proactive, interactive. If you read Acts chapter 2, it's a lot of people doing a lot of things together. But then if you fast forward the tape, you see a modern church today that is very spectator sport, that is highly consumptive in nature and does not require much from the attendee. I mean, he literally is an attendee. So it's the same thing we've seen in modern technology, where modern technology started off with this amazing collaborative, nature that it had. It was so amazing. And then over time, the corporations started carving profit out of it. This is one of your main theses. Talk about this, and also talk about, I really want you to also expound on how this open source idea could also impact America's educational system. Don't let me forget to ask you that. But on both of those fronts, can you comment?
Yeah, I mean, historically, I think it's important for people to remember that before the Reformation, there was this moment in history. There was feudalism, which wasn't too good. These feudal lords that made all these peasants just work on their land and give them the stuff. And it was a very abusive kind of time. And then they sent out people on the Crusades, and that wasn't really too good either. But when those soldiers came back from the Crusades, there was a brief moment in history where things got really good for people. The soldiers had come back with all of these, they opened up trading routes to the rest of the world. They came back with technologies and spices and innovations from around the world because they went to all these other places. And one of the innovations they brought back was, it was the Ottoman idea. It was the bazaar, it was called, and we called it the market. And at the market, people would come 1 or 2 days a week. They would bring their wares and they would sell stuff back and forth. It was, a lateral economy that they started to build together. So one person would bring in chickens, the other would make bread, someone would do horseshoes, someone would create windmills, and they traded with each other and invented all of these different kinds of money that they used at the marketplace just to grease the wheels of commerce. So they might have a kind of money like a poker chip that was only good for the day of trading. They had all these different ways of issuing cash that was all optimized for the velocity of a transaction so everyone could get the things they wanted. And this was around the year 1000 or 1100, even up to 1200 in some cases. And people started to get wealthy in this peer-to-peer, very hands-on, craft-based economy. The aristocracy got really upset by this because the people were getting wealthy. There was the rise of a middle class, and at least relatively, the aristocracy was getting poor as regular people got wealthy. So they came up with laws and mechanisms to really put all of the local people out of business, to repress this growing economy. One of them was what they called the chartered monopoly, which was like the precursor to the corporation. Chartered monopoly said that no one's allowed to do business in a particular industry except the one merchant who was chartered by the king. So the king picked his friend and said, you're the only one that can do shoes. And someone else, you're the only one who can do wheat. You're the only one who can travel to the East Indies. Anybody else who was in business for themselves now had to become an employee of that one business. And the other thing they came up with was central currency. So now you can't use any of those local monies or we'll kill you. Instead, you have to borrow our central treasury money at interest and pay it back. And that's what led to the growth-based economy that we live in. So now we've forgotten that that's even an operating system. We forgot that people invented those two innovations. We think that they're just again, conditions of nature, almost things that God decided would be there when they're not. And it's funny, it's the Catholics that got really the most upset by this because they were kind of in charge of things until this happened. And they look at, when King Henry VIII adopted these sorts of things and when he closed the commons, which was the church commons that it was controlled in some nasty ways too, but, that in theory, at least people were allowed to, grow their crops and bring their animals there. And the land was a shared thing rather than an owned thing. The church still looks back on that moment in history as, this is when it could have worked. And I look at digital technology and the peer-to-peer possibilities. eBay is a great example of what a peer-to-peer economy looks like, where people are sort of trading back and forth with each other without really, although eBay is a corporation in itself, but without corporations, really meddling too much or taking the lion's share of the profit. The internet allows for that kind of peer-to-peer thing to happen again. But the problem is most investors, most developers are still looking at it in the old way, that the internet is a place to grow even bigger corporations like Google and like Facebook, rather than enabling a peer-to-peer economy and letting people actually get out of the financial mess that we're in. I mean, an easy example for it. I mean, if that feels like an abstract concept to people, this idea of growth and prosperity and what's the difference, a great example is Twitter. Twitter's a wonderful little app. For those of you who don't know, it lets you send 140 character messages. Those are like text message, long messages to anyone, anywhere on the internet who's signed up to follow what you're saying. And Twitter currently makes $500 million per quarter. That's $2 billion a year off a 140 character messaging app. Now, I think that's a great achievement. If I went to my mom and said, you rest her soul now, I'm making $2 billion a year off a 140 character messaging app, she should be really happy for me, right? That's enough to run a company, $2 billion a year. But the investors in Twitter, Wall Street, considers Twitter an abject failure, a sob story. Why? Because it turns out that all you can really make off a 140 character messaging app is $2 billion. That's how far they can grow. That's the limit. That's it. It turns out that's all the world is willing to pay for a 140 character messaging app. Now, that should be fine. You should be able to live on $2 billion a year. But because they're in a growth-based economy, if they stop growing, they have to die. And that's absolutely unnecessary by the real laws of economics or the real laws of physics or the real laws of prosperity. It only makes sense that they have to die in an economy that is built to serve the growth of capital over everything else. And it's a sad, extractive state of affairs that we are in the position to change.
Douglas, let's talk about that peer-to-peer technology and how it could improve education, because that is something that I recently heard you mention that stoked a lot of curiosity in me, because it does seem that I have even heard, I think it was the founder of PayPal, Peter Thiel, who had made the comment that, and pardon those who are Catholic in the audience, but it's simply, and it is controversial to say something like this, but the point is that Peter Thiel had made the comment that today's educational system is a lot like the old Roman Catholic Church in the fact that the priesthood is the top of the food chain, so to speak, in the world of academia, the professors. And this concept that without being able to go through the entire college process, get the degree, and then be able to go to the corporate world, it's almost as if the public education system today, or the government-run education system today, holds the keys, just as the Roman Catholic Church once held the keys to eternity. He made that observation, and I thought to myself, how far education has gotten from this peer-to-peer technology that you speak of. How can we improve education by getting corporations out of the way?
Well, I don't agree with Peter Thiel on this. I mean, he was paying kids $100,000 not to go to college.
Right.
That's how much he likes education.
It certainly served his purposes. It certainly, yeah, of course. Yeah. I
mean, if you look at human beings in terms of their utility value, then you're going to think of education differently than I do. If you look at human beings for their utility value, what work can they create? How can they help our companies grow? Are they prepared for the jobs of our corporations? well, then we're going to get replaced by robots and machines and computers anyway, because computers and robots will always eventually have more utility value than people. They will pick cotton better. They will drive cars better. They will make cars better. They will design movie theaters better. They're machines. They do the stock market better. But if you, and I don't mean to get too spiritual on you, but if you see human beings as in any way sacred in their own right, if you see human beings not as the servants of the economy, but as the beings who are supposed to be served by the economy, then you start looking at education differently. The purpose of education is not to make someone a valuable worker. That's not what it's for. We had workers before we had education. The reason we came up with education in this country is because, like them or not, people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and the titans of industry looked at their workers and said, workers deserve to be able to read. They deserve to be able to think. They deserve to be able to enjoy music. They deserve to have minds. And they deserve to have some measure of class mobility, so that if there are workers who have great talents or great visions or great understandings of things, they should have the freedom to have some class mobility and to move up. So the purpose of education is not, if you're going to teach computers in school, it's not in order to teach kids, how to do an Excel spreadsheet so they can get a job, working in a cubicle somewhere. You're teaching them how to program, how to think about machines so they could design something, so they could change something. So you're actually developing the human intellect. Yes, in some ways, academia could be seen as a priesthood. And I know this as someone who, not until his 40s actually pushed through to get the PhD. And I saw, what is that? What is that? What is this system? How does that work? And in some sense, like anything or any advanced system, you do want there to be peers who look at you and say, are you ready? Is this person ready? It's like a guild in the old days. Can this person build bridges? Do we trust them to go to other towns and build bridges with the official guild as a member of our bridge building guild? I think if we live in a society where we've balanced, the hurdles of entry with the openness of inquiry, you end up in a really good place. I wouldn't want to lose the tradition of academia. I like the idea of disciplines because there's discipline involved in that. And I think discipline is okay. Just because something gets hard, as when you're teaching your kid long division, you need discipline to get to that next place. It's not Obama or the state saying you must learn long division. We all know now long division is something that's good. Even if calculators know how to do it, it's good for our brains to be able to see what is that? How does that work? You're a smarter, better person. But I think we do need to understand education more as the development of humans than as the training of workers. And if we understand that, then we're in a better position, particularly if we're moving in a world where not everyone may get to have a job anymore. We are running out of things that, for people to do on that level. So people are going to have to be more creative. They're going to have to invent new categories. They're going to have to be more entrepreneurial in the way they understand what does it mean to create value for other people, and how can I get compensated for that? And you have to be smart to do that. You can't just be another worker.
Do you see any examples of that going on, Douglas, that inspire you? Do you see anything on the web, any direction that the web is going that gives you signs of hope?
Yeah, I see ways that the world is going that gives me signs of hope. But, if we want to use technology, so, there's a company like Uber that I don't like because, Uber adopts that same scorched earth policy towards its markets. It doesn't care if all the taxi cab drivers go bankrupt because it just wants a monopoly in taxis so it can leverage into something else like drone delivery or robotic cars. At the same time, though, I see competitors to Uber where the drivers own the platform. So there's one in New York called Juno, and there's several others now. So imagine that. So now, instead of just working for, minimum wage or less for Uber and letting them leverage my driving, my labor, my car in order to reap tremendous profits, instead, I'm the guy that owns the platform because these the platform's cheap to make. These are small apps. They're not that complicated. But if the drivers own the app, then they're working for themselves. And even if they figure out how to replace themselves with robotic cars, guess what? They own the robotic car company now. Now they're the shareholders. So I'm starting to see that. It's called a platform cooperative, where the platform, rather than like Airbnb or Uber or Amazon, where it's all these people working for some set of shareholders, it's people actually working for themselves. There's a company in the West called Winco that's competing really well with Walmart. And the only difference between Winco and Walmart is that Walmart's owned by its workers, and they can pay the workers more, and the workers have shares in the company. And I've had shareholders of Walmart have come to me and they said, how can this company do it? How can they pay their workers more and still have the same prices as Walmart? And I tell them it's simple. It's because they don't have to pay you. You know, they don't have to give 90% of their winnings to shareholders who aren't actually contributing to the process. You know, so I see it all over the place. I see a lot of people understanding that digital, I mean, the word digital is based on the digits. It's the fingers. You know, that digital is the 10 fingers on your hands. It's why the book I wrote before this was, 10 commands for a digital age. I was trying to help people recall that when you get a new medium, like the Jews got text, you need commands in order to understand that new world. Although in that case, as receivers, in the read-only universe, we got commandments. Now in the read-write universe, we get commands. How does this actually work? We are the masters of digital technology as far as there are any. And that means this sort of hands-on work, this idea of people actually being participants in value creation rather than just, employees having their work and life energy drained from them by really abstract institutions that don't have our best interests at heart.
We're in the final moments with our guest, Douglas Rushkoff. He is the professor of media theory and digital economics at the City University of New York, Queens College, and he's also the author of a new book entitled Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus, How Growth Became the Enemy of Prosperity. Douglas, in our final moments, you touched on something that I did want to bring up. The introduction of written text obviously led to the writing of the Torah. I mean, we got the introduction of written text gave us Judaism. The printing press made the way possible, paved the way possible for the rise of Protestantism. And now we are on this digital wave, this new wave of this digital economy, and we have programming, not writing. It's not printing press. It's something completely different. And so you have said, if you're not a programmer in this world today, you are one of the programmed. Unpack that statement, and unpack that statement with particular insights for maybe a younger person who is in college, who's getting out of college and is looking at this daunting world that's so confusing. How can he become a programmer? What do you mean by that? And how can he not become one of the programmed?
Well, becoming a programmer doesn't necessarily mean, learning JavaScript, but it does mean understanding what the technologies you're using are actually for. Now, if you talk to most teenagers about Facebook, you say, what's Facebook for? They'll say, oh, Facebook's here to help me make friends or maintain my relationships and forge connections between other people. If you go to Facebook, you go into the boardroom, I promise you, they're not saying, how are we going to help Johnny make more enduring friendships? They're thinking, how are we going to monetize, how are we going to monetize Johnny's social graph? How are we going to, look at the data we have about Johnny and make money off him? Johnny is not the customer of Facebook. The marketing agencies that are buying Johnny's data, they're the customer of Facebook. Johnny is the product of Facebook. And that's what I mean by programmer be programmed. If you're not the programmer, if you're not the customer of the thing, then you're the product. If you're not the manager of the thing, then you're the worker. So we have kids who are spending countless hours putting together their profiles for these things and thinking, oh, look how well I'm using this. Look what a good picture I put up. And now I've got the best movies listed, the movies I like, and the books I like, and the rock stars I like. What are they really doing? Are they really creating a social profile? No, they're creating a consumer profile. They are giving Facebook all of their personal information, and every swipe they make on their smartphone whether you're in Facebook or not, every swipe you make on your smartphone gets smarter about you. That data is sent to Google and sent to Apple and sent to Facebook. They get smarter about you as you get dumber about it. That's why it is called the smartphone, because it is gaining in intelligence, and we know less and less about how that data, how that intelligence is being used. And that's why I'm calling on people, particularly young people, to figure out what something is really for before you start using it. And the easy way to figure out what something's for is to figure who's paying for it. Who's paying for this thing? Because chances are the person paying for it is the customer of that thing. And what you're providing may be something you didn't even realize you're giving.
Very valuable insights from our guest today, Douglas Rushkoff. His book is Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus: How Growth Became the Enemy of Prosperity. I have really enjoyed this today. This has been so fun. Would you tell our audience how they can get a hold of you, learn more about you and your work?
I guess go to rushkoff.com. That's rushkoff.com. And there's all sorts of stuff there. I got a mailing list. I'm not spamming people. It's like little articles that I write. And, I'm on CNN a lot. I write for The Atlantic and Fast Company and different things. But to really get inside my head, spend 4 or 5 hours with me in this last book, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. And, I think it's ultimately it's an empowering experience to see the economy as something that we can hack and, in the good sense, that we can, program for distributed prosperity instead of just, worldwide bankruptcy.
Douglas, thank you so much for your time. I sure do appreciate it.
Thank you. And thanks for what you do.